Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into Cheating Tales Lab. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sizzle of garlic and herbs filled the kitchen as Daniel Finch expertly diced vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic sound of his knife against the cutting board echoed through the spacious kitchen of their downtown penthouse. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that could read a person's intentions from across a negotiating table. Those same eyes had helped him build Finch Real Estate into one of the city's most successful property development firms. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the high-end appliances he'd installed during their last renovation. Daniel paused his chopping to adjust the temperature on the pan where fresh, herb-crusted salmon was cooking. He'd always enjoyed cooking, finding it a meditative break from the high-stakes world of real estate development. The sound of heels clicking on hardwood made him look up. His wife of 14 years, Josefina, strutted into the kitchen wearing a dress he'd never seen before, a tight black number that left little to the imagination. The dress probably cost more than what most people made in a week, but that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the perfume, an expensive, unfamiliar scent that he definitely hadn't given her. "Don't wait up, babes," Josefina said, barely glancing at him as she checked her reflection in the microwave door. Her long dark hair was styled in elaborate waves, and her makeup was heavier than usual. "I'm going on a date with my new lover." Daniel's hand tightened on the knife handle, but his movements remained controlled as he set it down beside the cutting board. In 14 years of marriage, through building his empire from the ground up and supporting her numerous failed ventures, the boutique that hemorrhaged money, the jewelry line that never launched, the lifestyle blog that attracted zero followers, he'd never imagined she'd have the audacity to be this brazenly disrespectful. "What nonsense is this?" he asked, his voice steady despite the cold fury building in his chest. His words carried the same quiet authority that had made competitors back down and partners fall in line. "You're not going anywhere." Josefina laughed, the sound sharp and mocking in the pristine kitchen. "Oh, sorry, but I promised Fernando a wild night." She reapplied her lipstick, smacking her lips at her reflection. "He's been so patient, waiting for me to tell you about us." Daniel observed her with the same calculating gaze he used when assessing a property's potential. He saw past the expensive dress and carefully applied makeup to the rot beneath, the entitlement, the ingratitude, the complete lack of loyalty or basic human decency. "Walk out that door," he said, his tone measured but glacial, "and our 14 years of marriage is over." His eyes, hard as steel, met hers in the microwave's reflection. "I mean it, Josefina." She turned to face him, her expression contemptuous. "Don't be dramatic, Daniel. We both know you're too weak to leave." Her lips curved in a cruel smile. "Who else would put up with you? Your boring business talks, your constant need for control, your pathetic attempts at being the perfect husband." She grabbed her designer purse, a 5-figure anniversary gift from him, and slung it over her shoulder. "Fernando knows how to treat a real woman." Maria, their housekeeper of 10 years, paused in the doorway, her eyes wide as she witnessed the scene unfolding. She'd always been fond of Mr. Finch, who treated her with respect and genuine kindness. Mrs. Finch, on the other hand, had been increasingly demanding and rude over the past year. "Maria," Daniel said calmly, not taking his eyes off his wife, "you can take the rest of the day off. With pay." "Si, Senor Finch," Maria replied quietly, shooting a disapproving look at Josefina before hurrying out. Josefina rolled her eyes. "Always the generous boss. Is that supposed to impress me?" She headed for the door, her heels clicking against the floor like bullets. "This is your last chance, Josefina," Daniel called after her, his voice carrying the weight of 14 years of patience finally running out. "Think carefully about what you're throwing away." She turned at the door, her smile venomous. "What am I throwing away? A boring life with a predictable man?" She laughed again, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Fernando has everything you don't: excitement, passion, and he's not afraid to take what he wants." He's shown me what I've been missing all these years while playing housewife to a man who thinks cooking dinner makes him husband of the year. The door slammed behind her, her mocking laughter lingering in the air. Daniel stood motionless in the kitchen, his expression unreadable. The salmon continued to sizzle in the pan, filling the air with an aroma that now seemed out of place in the tension-filled room. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he'd hoped he wouldn't need to use. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Rodney? Execute Plan 0. She finally did it. "Understood, Mr. Finch," Rodney replied without hesitation. "All the preparations are in place. Should I contact Mr. Church as well?" "Yes. Tell Jeffrey to file everything first thing in the morning. And Rodney? Make sure Sue sends over all the documentation tonight." "Will do, sir. And the offshore accounts? Start the transfers immediately. Leave no trace." Daniel ended the call and turned back to the stove. He removed the perfectly cooked salmon from the heat and began plating it with the precision of a man who hadn't just initiated the systematic dismantling of his marriage. The vegetables, still only half-chopped on the cutting board, would go to waste, but that hardly mattered now. As he sat down to eat his solitary meal, his phone buzzed with incoming messages from his team. Sue Wilkins, the private investigator he'd hired 3 months ago, was sending over the final batch of surveillance photos. Jeffrey Church, his attorney, confirmed receipt of all the necessary documentation. Rodney's team had already begun executing the carefully orchestrated financial maneuvers that would protect his assets. In his office down the hall, a security camera recorded multiple angles of the kitchen scene that had just played out. Daniel had installed the system shortly after noticing the first signs of Josephina's changing behavior. The footage would prove useful later, but for now, he focused on his meal, cutting into the salmon with the same precision he'd soon apply to severing all ties with the woman who'd so grievously underestimated him. Across town, in an upscale restaurant, Josefina sat across from Fernando Lehman, giggling as he poured her another glass of champagne. Fernando, with his carefully styled hair and expensive watch, looked every bit the successful businessman he pretended to be. What Josefina didn't know was that his real estate firm was hemorrhaging money, and he'd been eyeing Daniel's empire with growing desperation. "Did you see his face?" Josefina laughed, taking a sip of champagne. "He actually thought he could order me to stay home, as if I'm one of his employees." Fernando reached across the table to take her hand, his smile predatory. Poor Daniel, always thinking he's in control. "Wait until he discovers how long we've been planning this. He won't know what hit him," Josefina agreed, her eyes glinting with malice. "Once we're done, he'll have nothing left. Not his money, not his company, not even his precious reputation." Neither of them noticed the discreet woman sitting at the bar, apparently absorbed in her phone. Sue Wilkins had been tailing them for months, recording every meeting, every conversation, every damning statement. She snapped another photo of the couple and sent it to Daniel, along with a brief message. "Target meeting confirmed. Audio recording in progress." Back at the penthouse, Daniel had finished his dinner and moved to his home office. The wall of monitors displayed various feeds: security camera footage, financial transactions in progress, email correspondences between his team members. He sat in his leather chair, watching as his carefully laid plans began to unfold. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in, Maria." The housekeeper entered, still in her coat. "Senor Finch, I know you said to go home, but I wanted to make sure you were okay." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your concern, Maria, but I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Maria nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd watched Mrs. Finch's behavior deteriorate over the past year. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the increasingly extravagant purchases. "She doesn't deserve you, senor." "Never did." "Thank you, Maria. There will be some changes coming soon. I'd like you to take the next week off, with pay of course. When you return, things will be different." After Maria left, Daniel turned back to his monitors. A new email from Jeffrey caught his attention. The divorce papers were ready, complete with evidence of adultery and financial misconduct. Another message from Rodney confirmed that the offshore transfers were proceeding as planned. Daniel allowed himself a small smile as he watched the pieces fall into place. Josefina had called him predictable, boring, weak. She'd mistaken his patience for passivity, his planning for predictability, his self-control for weakness. Soon she'd learn the cost of that mistake. His phone buzzed with another message from Sue, Target and companion discussing plans to access joint accounts tomorrow morning. Audio recording attached. Daniel played the recording, listening to his wife and her lover plot to drain the accounts he'd already emptied. Their arrogance was almost amusing. They really believed they'd caught him unaware, that he was the fool they thought him to be. The night deepened outside the penthouse windows, the city lights twinkling like stars. In restaurants and hotels across town, Josefina and Fernando celebrated what they thought was their triumph, unaware that they were simply playing their parts in Daniel's carefully orchestrated endgame. As midnight approached, Daniel's phone lit up with a final message from Rodney. All assets secured. Offshore transfers complete. Real estate transactions prepared for morning execution. Waiting for your go-ahead. Daniel typed a single word in response. Proceed. He stood at the window, looking out over the city he'd helped build, one real estate deal at a time. Tomorrow, Josefina would discover the true meaning of the word weak. But tonight, he had one more call to make. Gladys? This is Daniel Finch. I apologize for calling so late, but there's something you need to know about your husband Fernando. The wheels of justice and revenge were now in unstoppable motion. Daniel Finch, the man Josefina had dismissed as predictable and weak, had orchestrated a response that would leave both her and her lover with nothing but the bitter taste of their own betrayal. In their arrogance, they'd forgotten the first rule of real estate and life. Never underestimate the quiet ones who take their time to plan. Jeffrey Church sat in his corner office at 6 a.m., reviewing the final documents for what would become one of the most meticulously planned divorce cases of his 30-year career. The morning sun hadn't yet risen over the city skyline, but the veteran attorney had been awake for hours, ensuring every detail was perfect. His phone buzzed. Daniel Finch. Everything's ready, Jeffrey said before Daniel could speak. Sue's documentation arrived at midnight. I've never seen more thorough evidence of adultery and financial misconduct in my life. Good. Daniel's voice was calm, controlled. Josefina spent the night at her mother's place, just as expected. Have the papers delivered there by 8 a.m. Already arranged. But Daniel, Jeffrey paused, shuffling through the extensive documentation. The level of their planned deception. They were going to try to drive you to suicide. The recordings Sue obtained. I know, Daniel cut him off. I've heard them all. Every dinner date, every hotel meeting, every conversation about how they'd spend my money once I was gone. Focus on executing the plan. 3 months earlier, Daniel had walked into Jeffrey's office with an unusual request. He needed to prepare for a divorce, but not file immediately. Instead, he wanted to document everything, prepare every legal motion, and wait for the perfect moment. Your wife's affair with Fernando Lehman has been going on for 6 months, Sue Wilkins had reported in that first meeting. The private investigator's photographs showed Josefina and Fernando entering various hotels, restaurants, and even the Finch penthouse when Daniel was supposedly away on business. The financial angle is worse, Sue had continued. They've been systematically draining your joint accounts. Lehman's real estate firm is failing. He's millions in debt. They're planning to take everything you have. Daniel had listened without expression, then laid out his counter-strategy. It was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its thoroughness. Now, 3 months later, everything was in motion. At 7 a.m., Rodney Martinez, Daniel's head of security, oversaw the team changing locks at the penthouse. The new owner's moving trucks would arrive by noon. Mr. Finch, Rodney spoke into his phone. The safe room contents have been transferred to secure storage. All surveillance equipment is operational. Mrs. Finch's belongings are being packed and moved to the garage as instructed. In another part of town, a courier knocked on the door of Elena Torres, Josefina's mother. The elderly woman answered in her robe, her face darkening when she saw the legal documents. Josefina, she called up the stairs. There's something you need to see. Josefina descended the stairs in yesterday's dress, makeup smeared, looking nothing like the triumphant woman who'd walked out on her husband the night before. She snatched the envelope from her mother's hands. "What is this nonsense?" she demanded, then froze as she read the first page. "Divorce papers? He can't be serious." Elena picked up the stack of photos that had fallen from the envelope. Images of Josefina and Fernando in various compromising situations. "Mija, what have you done? That bastard had me followed?" Josefina's voice rose to a shriek. She grabbed her phone, dialing Fernando's number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. Across town, in a palatial suburban home, Gladys Lehman held a similar envelope. Unlike Josefina's, hers contained a personal letter from Daniel, along with proof of her husband's infidelity and financial crimes. "How long?" Gladys confronted Fernando in their kitchen, her voice ice-cold. "How long have you been sleeping with her and stealing from her husband?" Fernando, still in his bathrobe, reached for the documents. "Darling, I can explain." "Explain what?" Gladys slapped a bank statement down on the marble counter. "How you've been funneling money from their accounts into your failing company. How you and that woman plan to drive her husband to suicide." She pointed to the door. "Get out. My lawyer will contact yours." Fernando's phone had been ringing nonstop, Josefina's calls. He ignored them all as he threw clothes into a suitcase, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Back at the penthouse, Daniel surveyed the space one last time. The furniture was already being moved out, the walls bare where family photos had hung. Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway with tears in her eyes. "Senor Finch," she said softly, "Mrs. Finch is calling the house phone." Over and over. "Let it ring," Daniel replied, signing the final transfer documents for the penthouse sale. "She'll figure it out soon enough." At 10 a.m., Josefina arrived at their private bank, dressed in fresh clothes and wearing her most entitled expression. "I need to make a withdrawal," she announced to the manager, sliding her card across the desk. The manager's face remained professionally neutral as he checked the account. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Finch, but these accounts have been frozen pending investigation of suspicious activities. Your credit cards have also been suspended." "What?" Josefina's voice echoed through the marble lobby. "That's impossible. Do you know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am. We also know about the unauthorized transfers you've been making to Mr. Fernando Lehman's accounts over the past 6 months. Our fraud department has extensive documentation." Josefina's face went from red to white. She grabbed her phone again, trying Fernando's number. Straight to voicemail. Meanwhile, in his temporary office at the city's most exclusive hotel, Daniel met with his executive team. The sale of Finch Real Estate to an international holding company was proceeding smoothly. None of his employees would lose their jobs. He'd made sure of that in the contract. The offshore accounts are secure, his financial advisor confirmed. All assets have been legally protected. Mrs. Finch won't be able to touch any of it. "And the evidence?" Daniel asked. Sue Wilkins laid a USB drive on the desk. "Everything's here. Security footage from your home, showing them there during your business trips. Audio recordings of them planning to drive you to suicide. Bank records of her theft. Photos of their meetings. Plus," she smiled grimly, "their conversations about how they'd spend your money once you were gone." Daniel nodded. "Send copies to all relevant parties, my lawyer, her lawyer, Fernando's wife, the fraud investigators. Let them see exactly who they're dealing with." By noon, Josefina had returned to the penthouse, only to find moving trucks in the driveway and strangers carrying furniture inside. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "This is my home." A man in an expensive suit approached her, holding out documents. "Actually, Mrs. Finch, this property was sold this morning. Legal transfer of ownership is already complete. Your belongings have been packed and placed in the garage, as specified in the sale agreement." Josefina stared at the papers, her hands shaking. "This isn't possible. He can't do this." "He already has," the new owner replied calmly. "I suggest you remove your belongings from the garage before 5 p.m., or they'll be considered abandoned property." In the garage, Josefina found her designer clothes, shoes, and jewelry packed in label boxes. Her hands trembled as she called her mother. "Mommy, I need help moving my things. Daniel sold the house. He's frozen the accounts. She choked back a sob. He's destroyed everything. No, Mija. Elena's voice was hard. You destroyed everything. Those recordings they sent me. Planning to drive him to suicide? Taking his money? I raised you better than this. But mommy. No. You made your choice last night. Now you live with it. The call ended. Josefina sank to her knees among the boxes of her designer life, her phone buzzing with notifications. Her credit cards were declined. The joint accounts emptied. Her access to Daniel's business accounts terminated. She tried Fernando's number again. This time, he answered. Stop calling me, he snapped. It's over. Gladys knows everything. I'm trying to save my marriage. Save your marriage? Josefina shrieked. What about our plans? The money. The money's gone. Josefina. Daniel was 3 steps ahead of us the whole time. My company's under investigation for fraud. Gladys is divorcing me. I've lost everything. But you said you loved me. Fernando's laugh was bitter. Love? We were using each other, and you know it. I wanted his money. You wanted excitement. Well, congratulations. You got your excitement. Hope it was worth it. The line went dead. By sunset, Josefina had managed to move her belongings into a storage unit, paying for it with her mother's credit card. She checked into a modest hotel, all she could afford now, and finally opened the full divorce filing. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos, videos, audio recordings, bank statements. Every meeting with Fernando documented. Every cruel comment about Daniel captured. Every stolen dollar traced. Her phone buzzed with a message from her best friend. I heard the recordings. How could you plan to drive him to suicide? Don't contact me again. Similar messages followed from other friends, each having received evidence of her betrayal. Her carefully curated social circle was evaporating as quickly as her access to Daniel's wealth. In his hotel suite, Daniel reviewed the day's events with his team. Everything had proceeded exactly as planned. The house was sold. The account secured. The evidence distributed. His business transferred. Phase 1 of his disappearance was complete. Sir, Rodney reported, Mrs. Finch is at the Grand Hotel. Mr. Lehman is at his club. His wife changed the locks. All their movements are being monitored. Good, Daniel replied. Maintain surveillance but keep your distance. Let them experience the consequences of their choices. Jeffrey Church arrived with updated legal documents. The judge was appropriately appalled by the evidence. Given the documented adultery and financial misconduct, Josefina won't be entitled to anything. Her lawyer already called to discuss settlement. No settlement. Daniel's voice was firm. She gets nothing except what's in those boxes. Let her live with the consequences of her choices. Sue Wilkins added her report. Fernando's company is facing a fraud investigation. His wife's family has cut off financial support. He's got nothing to offer Josefina now, even if he wanted to. Daniel stood at the hotel window, looking out over the city he'd conquered and would soon leave behind. They thought I was weak, he said quietly. They mistook patience for weakness, planning for passivity. Now they understand the difference. In her hotel room, Josefina stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The expensive dress from last night was wrinkled, her makeup smeared by tears. Her phone lay silent. No calls from Fernando. No responses to her desperate messages to friends. The woman who'd walked out on her marriage last night, so confident in her power, so certain of her victory, was gone. In her place was someone who finally understood what she'd thrown away. She'd called Daniel weak, called him predictable, boring. Now she understood. He'd been playing chess while she and Fernando played checkers. Every move calculated, every response planned, every consequence anticipated. Her phone buzzed one last time. A message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a video. Security footage from their home, showing her and Fernando laughing about Daniel, mocking him, planning his destruction. Below the video was a simple message. You confused kindness for weakness. That was your first mistake. The sun set on a changed city. In his hotel suite, Daniel finalized plans for the next phase of his life. In her budget room, Josefina faced her new reality. And somewhere in between, Fernando Lehman discovered that Karma had a particularly strict accounting system. Phase 2 of Daniel's plan would begin at dawn. But for now, He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They thought him weak, predictable, easily destroyed. They'd never suspected that the man they'd underestimated had been documenting their betrayal, preparing his response, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In the end, it wasn't Daniel who destroyed Josefina and Fernando. Their own arrogance, greed, and cruelty had done that. He'd simply stepped aside and let them fall into the trap they'd built for themselves. Charlie Rowe prided himself on being the best private investigator in the city. In 20 years, he'd never failed to locate a target. But Daniel Finch was proving to be his white whale. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Finch," Charlie said, watching Josefina pace his cramped office 3 months after Daniel's disappearance. Every lead goes cold. His business was sold to Maxwell Holdings, but it's a maze of shell corporations. His phone's disconnected, email accounts closed, credit cards canceled. The man's a ghost. That's impossible. Josefina slammed her hands on his desk, her designer dress now looking worn and dated. He has to be somewhere. Nobody just disappears. Charlie pulled up his research on his laptop. Mr. Finch sold Finch Real Estate for an undisclosed amount. The new owners retained all employees but have no contact with him. His lawyer, Jeffrey Church, handles everything through automated systems. Bank accounts? Emptied and closed. Properties? Sold or transferred. Digital footprint? Erased. Try harder. Josefina's voice cracked. "I'm paying you good money." "With what money, Mrs. Finch?" Charlie asked quietly. "Your last check bounced." Josefina's face crumpled. Her access to the joint accounts was long gone, her credit cards useless. She'd been reduced to living in a studio apartment paid for by her increasingly reluctant mother. I'll figure something out. Just find him." But Charlie had already decided this would be their last meeting. He'd seen divorces get ugly before, but this was different. The methodical way Daniel Finch had disappeared spoke of long-term planning and resources beyond anything Josefina could match. Across town, in her reduced circumstances, Josefina returned to her small apartment. The walls were bare where paintings had once hung, the furniture secondhand. Her phone, no longer the latest model, buzzed with a message from Fernando. "Stop calling Gladys. She won't help you find Daniel. It's over." Josefina threw the phone across the room. Fernando had crawled back to his wife 2 months ago, leaving Josefina alone with the consequences of their actions. Gladys, after the initial shock, had agreed to reconciliation, provided Fernando cut all contact with his former mistress. The laptop on her tiny desk dinged with an incoming email. Unknown sender. Subject line: "See what you lost." Her hands trembled as she clicked the video attachment. The footage was crystal clear, security camera recordings from her former home. There she was, bringing Fernando into the house while Daniel was supposedly away on business. The timestamp showed dozens of such visits over 6 months, but it was the audio that made her sink to her knees. Poor, predictable Daniel, her own voice mocked from the speakers. Always so controlled, so boring. "He actually thinks I love him." Fernando's laugh joined hers. "He's such a fool. Once we've pushed him over the edge, all this will be ours." A few more months of gaslighting, making him think he's losing his mind. The perfect suicide, Screen Josefina agreed. "No one will suspect anything. We'll look like the grieving widow and supportive friend who tried to help him through his depression." The footage continued, showing meeting after meeting, plotting session after plotting session. Their casual cruelty, their greedy plans, their mockery of the man whose life they planned to destroy, all captured in high definition. The final clip was different. Daniel sat in his home office, looking directly at the camera. "You thought I was weak, Josefina. You confused kindness for weakness, loyalty for foolishness. I built an empire while you plotted to steal it. Now you have nothing and I'm free." The screen went black. Josefina lunged for the bathroom, retching into the toilet as the full impact of her actions hit her. They'd never suspected the cameras. Never imagined Daniel was documenting everything, waiting, planning his counterstrike. 6 months turned into a year. Daniel Finch had vanished completely, but his influence lingered. The divorce was finalized in absentia, with the judge citing overwhelming evidence of adultery and financial misconduct. Josefina's attempts to claim alimony were laughed out of court. On a private island thousands of miles away, Daniel stood on the deck of his villa, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold. The property, purchased through an untraceable shell corporation years ago, was his sanctuary and command center. "The latest reports, sir," his assistant said, placing a tablet on the teak table. "The new developments in Singapore are exceeding projections. London office wants to expand." Daniel nodded, scanning the figures. His new ventures, run through a network of offshore companies, were thriving. The skills that had built his first empire were serving him well in creating his second. And the other matter? The assistant pulled up another screen. "Mrs. Finch lost her apartment last week, currently staying with her mother. Mr. Lehman's attempt to restart his business failed. Seems no one wants to work with him after the fraud investigation. He and Mrs. Lehman have relocated to a smaller house in the suburbs. Their social circle completely collapsed. The video evidence you released showed their true nature. No one wants to associate with people who plan to drive someone to suicide for money." Daniel smiled, sipping his whiskey. He'd learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't just taking away someone's possessions. It was letting the world see who they really were. Back in the city, Elena Torres watched her daughter picking at her dinner, a shadow of the confident socialite she'd once been. "The lawyer called again," Elena said. "There's no point in continuing the appeals. The evidence is too strong." "It's not fair," Josefina whispered. "He had no right to record us." "No right?" Elena's voice sharpened. "You brought your lover into his home, planned his death, stole his money, and you talk about rights? I didn't mean." "Yes, you did. Every word on those recordings, you meant. Now you're angry because you underestimated him, because he wasn't the weak fool you thought he was." Across the city, in their downsized suburban home, Fernando and Gladys Lehman were having their own reckoning. "Another rejection," Fernando said, closing his laptop. Every attempt to rebuild his business was met with closed doors. The fraud investigation had cleared him legally, but the reputational damage was permanent. "Perhaps," Gladys said coldly, "you shouldn't have planned to drive a man to suicide for his money. I've apologized 1,000 times. Not to Daniel Finch. Not that you could. No one knows where he is. The man you thought was so weak, so easy to destroy, he destroyed you instead. And I let you come back only because my family insisted on giving you a second chance." The weight of consequences pressed down on all of them. Josefina, once proud and beautiful, aged years and months. Fernando, the smooth-talking businessman, reduced to working in middle management at a small firm. Their grand plans of wealth and excitement replaced by the bitter taste of failure. Daniel's final message played on repeat in Josefina's dreams. "You confused kindness for weakness." She understood now, too late, that what she'd seen as boring predictability had been patient calculation. What she'd mistaken for weakness had been strength-gathering force. A year after his disappearance, Daniel's new empire flourished in the shadows. His private island became a base for operations that spanned continents. The man who'd seemed so predictable, so controlled, had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal his true power. The sunset painted his villa in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel raised his glass to the horizon, finally allowing himself to laugh. The lesson had been learned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's stepping back and letting their own actions destroy them while you watch from a safe distance, having taken everything they thought they could steal. In the city he'd left behind, his absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. Josefina wore last year's clothes and lived on her mother's charity. Fernando worked a job he hated, under the constant suspicious eye of a wife who'd never trust him again. Their friends crossed the street to avoid them. Their social invitations dried up, their attempts at redemption met with closed doors. They'd thought Daniel weak, predictable, easily destroyed. They'd never suspected that the man they'd underestimated had been documenting their betrayal, preparing his response, and waiting for the perfect moment to disappear with everything they tried to steal. In the end, Daniel Finch hadn't just escaped their plot. He'd turned it into the instrument of their own destruction. And somewhere on his private island, watching the sun sink into the ocean, he smiled at the perfection of karma served cold. Epilogue. 5 years later. The Sunrise Plaza Hotel's budget dining room wasn't where Josefina Finch, now back to Josefina Torres, had imagined spending her 45th birthday. The free continental breakfast lay untouched before her as she watched guests in business attire hurry past, her once manicured hands now showing signs of regular work. "Your shift starts in 20 minutes, her supervisor called out. "Table 4 needs clearing." Josefina nodded, adjusting her hotel uniform. After cycling through various jobs over the past 5 years, she'd landed here 6 months ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now worked in one of the hotels where she'd once met Fernando for their illicit rendezvous. "Torres." A guest snapped his fingers at her. "Coffee refill." She grabbed the pot, forcing a smile. The designer dresses and society galas felt like a distant dream now. The woman who'd once sneered at Daniel's boring life now spent her days clearing tables and changing sheets. Across town, in a modest suburban house, Fernando Lehman stared at his laptop screen. Another rejection email from a potential investor. His third attempt at starting a new business had failed before it began. His name, once respected in real estate circles, was now toxic. "You're going to be late for work," Gladys called from the kitchen. Their reconciliation had come at a steep price: complete financial transparency, a post-nuptial agreement that left him nothing if he strayed again, and a middle management job at her brother's construction supply company. "I'm coming," he replied, closing the laptop. The corner office and luxury car were gone, replaced by a cubicle and a used Honda. His salary barely covered their downsized lifestyle and the ongoing therapy sessions Gladys had mandated. Elena Torres, Josefina's mother, sat in her garden, reading a letter from her other daughter in Miami. Unlike Josefina, Maria had built an honest life, married well, and now ran a successful business with her husband. "Mama," Josefina's voice came from the small guest house where she now lived. "I'm heading to work." Elena sighed, remembering the day 5 years ago when Daniel's evidence had exposed her daughter's true nature. The social humiliation had been complete. Their family name, once respected in the community, was now whispered about in scandalized tones. In her tiny apartment above a laundromat, Sue Wilkins, the private investigator who documented Josefina's affair, was reviewing case files when a news alert caught her eye. Finch International Holdings, one of Daniel's shadow companies, had just completed another major acquisition. She smiled, remembering the meticulous man who'd hired her 6 years ago. His disappearance had become something of an urban legend in their circles. The businessman who'd outsmarted those who tried to destroy him and vanished without a trace. Jeffrey Church, now semi-retired but still handling select cases, occasionally received encrypted messages from untraceable accounts. Updates on business ventures, legal matters to be handled, all executed through a labyrinth of shell corporations that always led back to Daniel Finch's brilliant strategic mind. Another wire transfer came through, his assistant mentioned. "The Children's Hospital wing is fully funded." Daniel's philanthropy, like everything else about him, operated in the shadows. The hospital wing would bear another name, the source of its funding hidden behind layers of corporate entities. Maria, the former housekeeper, had received a generous severance package and glowing references when Daniel disappeared. She now ran her own successful cleaning service, her first contracts mysteriously arranged through connections she'd never made. "Did you hear about Mrs. Finch?" one of her employees asked during lunch. "She's working at the Sunrise Plaza now." "Cleaning rooms." Maria crossed herself, remembering the proud woman who'd treated her with such contempt. God's justice comes to everyone, sooner or later. At the exclusive Reynolds Club, where Josefina had once been a prominent member, her name had been quietly removed from the rolls. The recordings of her plotting Daniel's suicide had sealed her social death warrant. The women who'd once been her closest friends now pretended not to see her when their paths crossed. "I saw Fernando at the grocery store," one society matron whispered to another over lunch. "Can you believe Gladys took him back? After what he did?" "Money," her companion replied. "Her family insisted. Something about protecting their business interests. But I heard she makes him account for every penny he spends." Charlie Rowe, the investigator Josefina had hired to find Daniel, had long since closed her file. But occasionally, he'd catch whispers in professional circles about major deals being closed by companies that seemed to appear from nowhere, operate with stunning efficiency, then fade back into the corporate mist. Finch, he'd mutter, recognizing the strategy. Still out there, still winning. In their downsized suburban life, Fernando and Gladys maintained a careful peace. Their weekly therapy sessions had revealed the full extent of his character flaws, the narcissism, the financial manipulation, the endless lies. How was work? Gladys asked mechanically as Fernando returned home. Fine, he replied, hanging up his jacket. No longer designer, bought off the rack at a department store. Their conversations were polite, sanitized, devoid of the passion he'd claimed to find with Josefina. His office cubicle held a single photo, him and Gladys in happier times. His phone contained a blocked number list full of Josefina's desperate attempts to contact him over the years. The last time he'd seen her, through the window of the Sunrise Plaza as he passed by, she'd been cleaning the lobby windows. The divorce settlement had left her with nothing, her attempts at appeals dismissed by increasingly irritated judges. The evidence Daniel had gathered was ironclad: the theft, the affair, the calculated plot to drive him to suicide. On his private island, Daniel Finch stood on the deck of his expanded villa, reviewing reports from his global business empire. At 50, he'd grown more distinguished, success and freedom adding an aura of quiet power to his bearing. Sir, his assistant appeared with a tablet. The latest intelligence report on the targets. Daniel reviewed the updates on those he'd left behind. Josefina working at the hotel, Fernando trapped in suburban mediocrity, their social circles shattered, their ambitions crushed under the weight of their own actions. The Singapore development? He asked, moving on to business matters. Exceeded projections by 20%. London office suggests expanding into emerging markets. He nodded, making decisions worth millions with the same calm precision he'd once used to cook dinner in that kitchen where Josefina had announced her betrayal. The man she called boring now controlled a business empire that spanned continents. In her guest house behind her mother's home, Josefina sat on her bed after another exhausting shift. The tiny space was a far cry from the penthouse she'd once called home. On her dresser, a framed photo face down. Her and Daniel on their wedding day, before greed and arrogance had consumed her. She picked up her phone, accessing a video she'd watched countless times over the years. Daniel's final message played on the screen. You confused kindness for weakness, loyalty for foolishness. I built an empire while you plotted to steal it. Now you have nothing and I'm free. The words hit harder now, after 5 years of consequences. The designer dress she'd worn that night hung in her closet, a reminder of her hubris. She'd kept it, though she'd never wear it again. It was all she had left of her former life. Elena watched from her kitchen window as her daughter left for another early morning shift. The proud, entitled woman who'd plotted a man's death for his money now took buses to work, packed lunch in plastic containers, lived on tips and minimum wage. Perhaps, Elena murmured, this is what you needed to learn humility. In his corporate office, Fernando's brother-in-law watched him through the glass walls of his cubicle. The man who'd once boasted of destroying Daniel Finch now filled out inventory reports, supervised by people who'd once been his subordinates. Lehman, his supervisor, called. The quarterly reports are due. Fernando bent over his work, avoiding the knowing looks from colleagues who'd heard the stories, read the news, seen the evidence of his cruel plotting exposed. On his island, Daniel raised a glass to the sunset. His network of businesses grew stronger each year, his influence expanding quietly but inexorably. The man they'd underestimated had not only survived their plot, but had emerged stronger, wiser, free of the constraints of his old life. Sir, his assistant appeared. Mrs. Torres attempted to access one of your old email accounts again. Daniel smiled slightly. Let her. There's nothing to find. He turned back to the sunset. Some people never learn. They mistake kindness for weakness, patience for passivity. Their own nature becomes their punishment. The lesson he'd learned proved true again and again. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's letting their true nature destroy them while you watch from a safe distance, having taken everything they thought they could steal. In their separate lives of quiet desperation, Josefina and Fernando had learned the same harsh truth. They'd plotted to destroy a man they thought was weak, only to discover that what they'd mistaken for weakness had been strength gathering force. Their punishment wasn't just the loss of wealth and status. It was living with the knowledge that they destroyed themselves through their own greed and cruelty. And somewhere on his private island, Daniel Finch raised his glass to the setting sun, his empire growing, his freedom complete. His revenge served not in a single blow, but in the slow, inexorable grinding of consequences that would follow his betrayers for the rest of their lives. The night settled over the city they'd all once called home. In her tiny guest house, Josefina set her alarm for another early shift. In his suburban home, Fernando prepared for another day of mundane work under his brother-in-law's watchful eye. And on his island, Daniel Finch reviewed plans for his next business expansion. The man they called weak now stronger and more successful than ever. The best revenge, he'd learned, wasn't just about taking away what someone valued. It was about letting them live with the consequences of their choices, watching their own nature become their punishment, while you thrived in the freedom they tried to steal.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.